We left off last week talking about God's sovereignty in sending Joseph to Egypt. So his brothers have come back to Egypt, and Joseph has finally revealed himself to his brothers. So finally, his brothers know that this guy that we sent off into slavery is still alive, and they freak out. They're afraid because of what he might do to them, and yet instead of giving them justice, he decides to show grace. And the reason that he shows that grace is he recognizes God's sovereign plan has been at work. And so we saw from that because of God, if we recognize God's sovereign work in our lives, it helps us to show the grace of God to other people and to not have to live with this sort of vengeance-minded thing of anytime someone wrongs us, retribution must come to them, because we can recognize, well, God was doing something good even whenever someone was doing wrong to us. Joseph's message, we're going to pick up still in, Joseph's still talking to his brothers there in Egypt, and we stopped kind of halfway through that. But I want to point out there in Genesis chapter 44, yeah, I'm clicking all those things because I already said that. Did I say, I didn't say that one yet. Do I go back? No, wait, no, we got it. Got it, okay. So I want to point out, there in Genesis 45, he says this stuff in verse 7, God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he's pointing to God's activity in all of this. And I want to point out, as he continues talking, Joseph's message to his brothers, first of all, is beginning with God and what God has done. But then when he tells his brothers to go and talk to their father, his message to his father also begins with God and begins with what God has done. He says in verse 9, hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord over all of Egypt. So that's, again, he's pointing back to what it is that God has done in the life of Joseph. He's not saying, look at all this stuff that I have done, look at these ways that I can build up my reputation or anything like that. He's saying, God has done this in my life. And that is a reason that Jacob should believe them and should be willing to come down, is because this is something that God could have done. So let's read from there as Joseph turns to his brothers and gives them this message for his father Jacob. Hurry up and go to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, and your flocks and your herds, and all that you have. There I will provide for you, for there are yet 5 years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have do not come to poverty. And now your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see, that it is my mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father of all my honor in Egypt, and of all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here. Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept upon his neck, and he kissed all of his brothers and wept upon them. After that, his brothers talked with him. So, I ended off last week saying this idea that God sovereignly provides bountifully for his people. So in God's activity, he's not just kind of giving the bare minimum to his people. He is giving them above and beyond what they necessarily needed. So in verse 8, Joseph describes himself as having become a father to Pharaoh, that he is even in a position of influence over Pharaoh. God didn't just make this way for Joseph to have just enough influence that his people could be saved. He put him above and beyond that. He's all the way up even as a father to Pharaoh. He sends his family to live in the land of Goshen, which is described in the narrative as the best of the land. This is a fertile land. This is a good place to go and live. He provides them a dwelling place, and that is temporary. It's not the promised land, but it is a good place. He's providing bountifully for them. And in verse 11, Joseph says, "There I will provide for you." So now it is through Joseph that God is providing for the families of Israel. It is through Joseph that God is preserving his people. And after all of that, in verse 12 through 15, Joseph reassures them, and he embraces them, and he weeps with them. And it says right there at the end of verse 15, after that, his brothers talked with him. And that seems like just kind of a passing statement of, okay, they had a conversation then, who knows what they said. But remember what one of the very first things we heard in the Joseph narrative was, all the way back in chapter 37. It said his brothers could not speak peacefully with him. That was from the very beginning. There was this fraternal strife and this brotherly animosity that kept them from even speaking peacefully to him. And now here they are finally able to talk to him again. And so Joseph is neutralizing this threat of the seed of the woman, this fraternal strife and this brotherly animosity. Joseph has neutralized it by showing grace and by choosing not to extend that strife by his retribution of his brothers. So that is, you start to see in these chapters, you start to see these themes that ran through the whole book of Genesis. You start to see them actually tied up in the life of Joseph. And this is one of them, that Joseph now is tying up that theme of fraternal strife. And what you see in the sons of Jacob is very different than what you see elsewhere. So you see Jacob and Esau are reconciled, and so their brotherly strife is kind of settled. But Esau is still the cast out one. You see in Ishmael and Isaac, Isaac is the son of the promise, Ishmael is the cast out one. You see in Cain and Abel, obviously Abel dies, but then Cain is a cast out one, and Seth ends up being the son of promise. And so you see the promise extended through one person, and the others are cast out because of this brotherly strife that's been happening. That doesn't happen with Jacob's sons. And I think it's partly because of the way that Joseph has worked to resolve that strife. You see, yes, the weight of the blessing is going to go to Judah and to Joseph's sons, but you don't have anyone in any of these sons, and we're going to talk more about Jacob's blessings of his sons, but you don't see any of these sons as a cast out son that is now excluded from the promises of God. Now, instead of just being like, not Ishmael, it's Isaac. Not Esau, it's Jacob. It's not all of you guys, it's Joseph. It's instead, it's Reuben and Simeon and Judah and Joseph and Issachar, and all of these people are included into this. So now God's promise is starting to spread out. And his promise has always been, I'm going to make you into a great nation. So that had to happen at some point, and it happens here because Joseph chooses to recognize the sovereignty of God, and it is because of him that this brotherly strife is supposed to be cut off. So what happens next is God provides for the people. It's through Joseph, but it's also through Pharaoh. So Pharaoh in verses 16 through 20 kind of reiterates what Joseph has said, and he offers them the best of the land, and it shows us that best of the land is in Goshen. And then what Pharaoh does is he doesn't just invite them, but he loads them up with all sorts of stuff. So if you look in verse 21, it says, Joseph gave them wagons according to the command of Pharaoh and gave them provisions for the journey. To each and all of them he gave a change of clothes, but to Benjamin he gave 300 shekels of silver and 5 changes of clothes. To his father he sent as follows: 10 donkeys loaded with good things of Egypt, 10 female donkeys loaded with grain, bread, and provision for his father on the journey. Then he sent his brothers away, and as they departed he said to them, "Do not quarrel on the way." So he's loading them with all sorts of stuff. And again, we saw this before in Potiphar's house. But remember, one of the promises to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob is, I will bless those who bless you. And here you see Pharaoh is blessing the people of Israel. And Pharaoh, as the narrative goes on, you're going to see Pharaoh is blessed deeply by the way that he has blessed them. Hold that in stark contrast with the story of Exodus that is going to come later. Pharaoh is going to curse the people of Israel, and he is going to receive the curse. So you see God's faithfulness to his promises, both in blessing and in judgment, is seen in the lives of these pagan kings of Egypt. But in verse 22, notice clothing comes up again. They really care about people's clothing, and this time around, instead of his brothers taking away Joseph's clothing, it's Joseph giving clothing to his brothers. So the tables are very much turned, and it's creating this arc where it was a lot of bad stuff and clothes being taken away, and now the arc is coming back where the good stuff is, instead of clothes being taken away, clothes are being given first to Joseph, and now Joseph giving his clothes back to his brothers. You also see silver again. Joseph gives his brothers silver, and he's been doing this secretively, but now he's giving it openly, and particularly to Benjamin that it mentions. He gives him all this silver and blesses him, and then says, do not quarrel along the way. And I don't know if he just knows his brothers well enough that he knows that it's a long journey ahead of you, and that's something that they would probably do. Maybe it's that you already saw whenever they are in trouble that Reuben steps up and says, didn't I tell you guys we shouldn't have done this? So you see kind of that, I told you so, or you should have listened to me. And maybe Joseph here is just saying, none of that. This was all God's plan, right? This was all God's doing to send me here. Don't argue. The word there for quarrel could be translated a lot of different ways, actually. There's some things that you could translate it, do not fear along the way. Like, don't be afraid that I'm going to come after you and get you. It could just be, don't get agitated. Like, don't get frustrated on the way. But I think it makes sense to say don't quarrel along the way, that they're not supposed to stir up the fraternal strife that Joseph has just neutralized there in Egypt. So Pharaoh loads them up. They are sent back. And then at the end of chapter 45, you see them come to Jacob. And Jacob's response is really, really interesting whenever they bring him this word. So verse 25, they went up out of Egypt and came to the land of Canaan to their father Jacob. And they told him, Joseph is still alive, and he is ruler over all the land of Egypt. And his heart became numb, for he did not believe them. But when they told him all the words of Joseph, which he had said to him, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. And Israel said, it is enough. Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. That scene is really striking to me. I can just imagine Joseph's brothers that Jacob doesn't really like. Like, Jacob has shown that he is just not really pleased with his sons. And here they come bringing up his son that he lost 20 years ago and saying something totally outlandish, like he's Lord over all of Egypt. I can see just his heart sinking and think, like, why are you doing this to me? Why are you saying this to me? But as they continue to talk to him, his spirit is revived and he believes them. And I don't know that there's any kind of major application that comes from that to our lives, but I do think it's a really interesting touch on the story and just the narrative of, like, thinking about the emotions of Jacob in all of this. And Jacob, if you know Jacob's life, he's been a trickster and he has been a liar and a deceiver his whole life. And then here at the end, he just assumes that they're lying and deceiving him at this point. And yet it is the truth that is going to be a life-changing thing for him. And it's interesting, Jacob is really not optimistic about his lifespan through all of this. Like he thinks he's about to die. He thinks he might not even make it down to Egypt. When he talks to Pharaoh in a little bit, he's like, "Yep, I've got short number of years, 130 years. It's been brutal." Like, but then he ends up going down and he lives for 17 more years after going down into Egypt. But God has this pattern, though, of providing abundantly for his people. And I want to point out it's not just this provision as they go into Egypt of providing abundantly. If you want to keep your finger there right at the end of chapter 45 and go over all the way to the New Testament to Ephesians chapter 3. In Ephesians chapter 3, I want to read a little section from this, starting in Ephesians 3:14. We know that the people of Israel were God's people in this Old Covenant, Old Testament story, but that honor of being the people of God has now been opened up to all nations, and that's what we are allowed to experience now, is we can be the people of God. And if you look in Ephesians 3, verse 14, this is Paul writing to the Ephesians. He says, "For this reason I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named." That kind of calls back the promises, right? By your descendants, all families of the world will be blessed. So it's kind of the similar language there. "That according to the riches of his glory, he may grant you to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in your inner being." According to the riches of his glory. Not according to kind of like, I'll give you a little bit of power to be strengthened. It's overflowing from God's riches of glory. He is pouring out and lavishing on us this blessing. Verse 17, "So that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may have strength to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God." This is not like a little blessing of, I'm going to give you just a little piece of me. I'm going to give you a little bit of knowledge of me, a little bit of strength. I'm going to give you just like this much. It is that you may know all of the breadth and the height and the depth, this love that surpasses knowledge, and that you would be filled with all the fullness of God. Whatever that means, that is an incredible promise to us, that we would have the fullness of God. That is a greater blessing than anything that you could imagine in this world. And then it goes on in verse 20 to say, "Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than all we could ask or think, according to the power at work within us, to him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen." This is a picture of a God who is ready and willing to do abundant things for us and to bless abundantly. And I think learning from this, the heart of God and what he wants to do for his children, I don't think that our problem usually is we ask too much of God. I think sometimes we are hesitant to pray in certain ways as if we don't want to run God's meter of abundant goodness out. Like we don't want to run him to the end of his generosity and his willingness to bless us. I think we usually ask way too little of God, because he is ready and willing to give us far more than we could ever think or imagine. And that is not, I don't say that in terms of like, ask him for money and you get super rich, it'll be great. Like we're not talking just about like earthly blessings. But if we as the people of God, if our highest value is God himself, then God is ready and willing to pour that out to us and give us far more than we could possibly imagine. God is providing something for us that's way better than the worldly possessions that we could seek on this world. And so that allows us to rest in his plan, because we know that he's not just going to let us scrape by and barely be happy for eternity. He is making a way for us to be abundantly provided for, and that he's going to get glory, but he's going to provide a glory for us that we couldn't imagine. So I think we find joy in the abundant provision of God. And practically speaking, I've just realized I haven't touched this thing in a long time. Fraternal conflict neutralized. That's great. Pharaoh blesses Israel. That happened. Ephesians. Wow. Look at that. Okay. Yeah. So the next thing, just practically speaking, we should learn how he wants to provide for others through us. Knowing that the way he abundantly provides for us as God's people, and knowing he will always give us far more than we could ever imagine, we should turn around and give generously elsewhere. If you look at the life of Joseph, Joseph's life is a lifetime of God providing for him, and God being with him in a time of struggle, and God putting him in the right position, and God blessing him in all of these ways. What does Joseph do with it here? He doesn't turn that blessing into vengeance or turn that blessing into personal gain. He pours that blessing out for the blessing of others. He sees how God wants him to use it to provide for other people. So just asking the question of ourselves from this, how does God want me to provide for other people? Knowing how he is always abundantly providing for me and how he will always provide abundantly for me, how is he wanting to use me to provide for other people? Because he does this, he provides for people through other people. Maybe it's a physical thing. Maybe there are people in need all over the world. There are people in need here where we live. Maybe God wants you to provide physically for someone who is in need. And there are ways to do that. If you don't know how to do that, there are ways to do that through the church and to give financially. We support things like Send Relief with the North American Mission Board and the IMB, where the floods in eastern Kentucky and tornadoes last year and hurricanes in Florida and all this stuff. The Southern Baptists have a great organization where we are providing for people in need, and we can contribute to that. We can give to that. We can physically go and help people, and there's a lot of ways to contribute to those things. But also consider how God may want you to provide for people spiritually, and recognize that there are people in our church and around our church that are in desperate spiritual need. They need to hear the gospel of Jesus, or they need encouragement. They need someone to come along beside them and disciple them. Ask the question of who is it that God has put you in a position to bless them spiritually? I think about, we've got some people in here are D group leaders for our students. Our students they need an adult there to walk them through what does it mean for me to have a consistent Bible study, and what does it mean for me to apply the Bible to my life and see the world through a biblical perspective. And we have adults who have just small groups of kids, and they're just reading the Bible with them, and they are teaching them that and showing them that. That is a spiritual need that they are meeting in the life of a student. And there's people like that all over our church and all around our community that need that. Maybe it's just a brother or sister in Christ who needs a quick encouragement. If you have a moment where you think of a person, pray for them and let them know that you're praying for them, and that can be an incredible encouragement to someone. Just consider the ways that it is that God wants you to extend his provision to the people around you. So, any questions on 45 before we go on to 46? Well, so as we go on to 46, we see a vision from God to Jacob. And again, you're going back and forth between the name Jacob and Israel. But here, Israel, it's taking his journey down to Egypt. So chapter 46, verse 1 says, Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. So we see this vision from God, which is not normal in the Joseph narrative. We've seen God communicate through dreams to people in the Joseph narrative, but there's been large chunks of the Joseph narrative where it doesn't seem like God's around. It doesn't seem like he's speaking into this. You have that in chapter 39, he's very obviously present, where it says the Lord was with Joseph. But in a lot of other places, it's like, where is God? What is God doing? And yet we know from the big picture, God's been there the whole time. God's been acting in Joseph's life this whole time, whether it's obvious in chapter 39 or whether it's not so obvious in other parts of the narrative. But here, God comes and he actually speaks to Jacob. And where he is Beersheba, which is a place that's popped up multiple times in Genesis. I think the first place you see it is with Abraham. Abraham makes a covenant with Abimelech, which is just an earthly king, and they give gifts to one another, and they make this covenant. Later, Isaac goes to Beersheba, and he makes another covenant with another Abimelech, which is interesting. But more significantly, God appears to Isaac there at Beersheba. Isaac makes an altar, and he sacrifices things to God there at Beersheba. So now Joseph is showing up at this place that his father made this altar and dug a well, and so it's a family history there that has happened, and God is appearing to him here at Beersheba. But what's happening here is it's showing God's presence. First of all, he says, I myself will go down with you to Egypt. So that's don't be afraid to go, because I'm going to be with you. God's presence is there, and he's renewing his promises that he is going to make him a great nation there in Egypt. We've been waiting for this great nation to happen, and he's saying, this is where I'm going to do it. Don't be afraid to go down to Egypt, because that's what I'm doing through you going down into Egypt. Now, remember, God has promised the offspring of Jacob the land of Canaan. So that seems like, why would we go down to Egypt now? And he's saying, don't worry, that promise is still intact. I'm going to bring you back up out of Egypt. That's also interesting because Jacob dies in Egypt. Jacob isn't brought up out of Egypt. But remember, Jacob is representing the whole nation of Israel. And so this is a foreshadowing of the Exodus that is going to happen. He is promising that the people will not just go to Goshen and think this is a great life and just never come back to Canaan. God will bring him up out of it. There have been times that God has explicitly told them not to go down into Egypt, like Isaac in chapter 26. He says, don't go down into Egypt. But here he gives him permission and says, go down into Egypt. This is where I'm going to make you a great nation. So there's three promises really in this. He says, I will go down with you. So you have the presence of God is really significant. I will also bring you up again, which is the promise that anticipates the Exodus. And then Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. It's going to be Joseph who is going to be with you when you die. And that is something that only a few days before Jacob would have thought was absolutely impossible and could never possibly happen. But God is now affirming this in the life of Jacob, that this is what is going to happen. Now, the promise of I will bring you back up out of Egypt, it's kind of partially fulfilled in chapter 50. Later, the bones of Jacob are taken up out of Egypt, and he's buried in Canaan with his fathers. But I do think it's pointing us further forward to the Exodus, there's an anticipation that they are not going to stay in Egypt this whole time. So all of this, we should be learning to trust in God's promises. In blessing and in judgment, always God's promises are worth trusting. So God is definitely going to bring them up out of Egypt because he said so. So then what you get in verses 5 through 27, it's a list of the family of Jacob. And I'm not going to read through all of it, but that's not because it's insignificant. just this description of the family of Jacob and this group that is going down, there are 70 people already that are going down into Egypt. This is, you see God's plan starting to work, that this is like a small little nation that is going down into Egypt. It's going to be brought up out of Egypt much larger. It's going to grow into a great nation in Egypt. But the descriptions of the people, for us, we look at these and we see a bunch of random names. We see some significance. So there's Perez as one of the sons of Judah. We know that that's an ancestor of King David. So that's a little bit significant. But think about an Israelite or a Hebrew who is reading in Genesis here. These names would be their tribes and their clans and their families. So like when it says that Elon, that's not Elon Musk, but like the sons of Zebulun, Elon, like that's not just a random name. That is, like, if you're in the tribe of Zebulun, like, you recognize, oh, Elon, that's us. That's our family. This is God not only bringing us down to Egypt, but this is God who has now brought us up out of Egypt. And so we are, like, this is like, that's our place in these promises as it's describing these names. So there are significant people in there. Like I said, you've got Levi, which is going to be ancestor of Moses and of Aaron, the priests. And you've got Perez, who is the ancestor ultimately of Jesus. And then you've got the descriptions of Joseph's sons there. But all in all, at the end, it says that there are 70 people that go down with Jacob. That 70 is a number of completeness and a number of like fulfillment in the Bible. It says explicitly here that doesn't include Jacob's sons' wives. That doesn't include like other children. If you look at other descriptions of this happening in the Bible, sometimes the numbers are a little different. It doesn't say that there were just 70. It actually adds some names here and there, and there's different ones in different parts of the Bible. I don't see that as a contradiction that's happening here. I think that the writer of Genesis, Moses, is specific here for a specific reason, putting this particular group of names together and saying this is 70 people who are going down with Jacob, because that's a sign of God's fulfillment of his promises, in that there are these 70 people going down. That there are a lot more than 70 people, though, because of children and the wives of Jacob's sons. And so there's a lot of people going down into Egypt at this point. Yes, so that's the start of the 12 tribes of Israel, and then the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's sons as well, are in there, which is interesting. I always get confused because there's technically 13 tribes because Joseph is split into 2 tribes, but then Levi is sort of kind of a tribe because they don't get a piece of land because they're the priests. So there's 12 tribes of Israel, but also there's 13. That's weird, but whatever. So verse 28 is very interesting here. It says he sent, this is coming out of all of the description of who went, he had sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to show the way before him in Goshen, and they came into the land of Goshen. So once again, we see Judah, not Reuben, not Simeon, not any of these other sons of Jacob. It's Judah that is sent before him. And just Judah being emphasized here, actually, even in the original language. Okay, nerd time here. Again, Hebrew, usually your direct object of the sentence is it's later on in the sentence. So Judah in this sentence is a direct object. He sent Judah. So like in English even, that's a sentence. He sent Judah. Judah's the last word. This sentence is rearranged to where it's Judah he sent. Judah's at the front of the sentence. And whenever they do that in Hebrew, they're emphasizing that's the word. It's saying it's Judah that he sent in the first place. It's emphasizing this fact that he is now looking at Judah as Judah's the one that's going to lead us down into Egypt now. Judah is going to be this one who's going to guide us to the land of Goshen. So even just in like the grammatical syntax of the thing, Moses is emphasizing here, Judah's a big deal. Judah is the one that is now leading them. A commentator that I wrote on this said, it's ironic that Judah is selected to play the lead role, to be the mediator in the forthcoming reuniting of a long-separated father and son, because earlier he had played the lead role in separating the father and the son. Earlier, he was the one leading the way in sending Joseph down, and now he's the one leading the way towards this reunion. But then verse 29 to 34, we see this emotional reunion of Joseph to his father. So it says, Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to meet Israel, his father, in Goshen. He presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. And Israel said to Joseph, Now let me die, since I have seen your face and know that you are still alive. Again, lives another 17 years, whatever. Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and tell Pharaoh and will say to him, My brothers and my father's household, who were in the land of Canaan, have come to me. And the men are shepherds, for they have been keepers of livestock, and they have brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have. And when Pharaoh calls you and says, What is your occupation? You shall say, Your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth even until now, both we and our fathers, in order that you may dwell in the land of Goshen. For every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. So Joseph here seems to be giving them instructions that allow them to get into Goshen specifically. It's a little confusing because he's saying, tell them you're shepherds, because Egyptians hate shepherds. Like, that doesn't seem to make any sense here. But I think what's probably going on here is Goshen is a place that would be good for shepherds, that's a little bit separated away from the Egyptians, but is a good place for them to live. And so this is going to play into the plan for them to be in Goshen, which Pharaoh has already said can happen, but Joseph is, I guess, hedging his bets here. But maybe it's an encouragement here even for them to be honest with Pharaoh, instead of trying to present themselves as something that they're not, in talking to Jacob, a guy who's been lying and deceiving his whole life, and talking to Jacob's sons who have been lying and deceiving their whole lives. Maybe he's just telling them, be honest in this, and this is how the Lord is going to provide for you. So in chapter 47, that happens. Joseph goes to, and he talks to Pharaoh. They say exactly what he's told them to, and he lets them go to Goshen. And he says specifically in verse 6 of chapter 47, the land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them settle in the land of Goshen. So it's saying this really is the best of the land. And he says, if you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock as well. So this is, again, Pharaoh is blessing the people of Israel, and he is going to receive the blessing of them. Now, Joseph, verse 7, brings Jacob, his father, and stands him before Pharaoh. And it says there in verse 7, Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And then it says it again later in verse 10, Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out in the presence of Pharaoh. This should strike us as a little strange. Pharaoh is the king of Egypt. Pharaoh is the one that is able to bless, right? Pharaoh is the one who's able to receive and give blessing to this foreigner who's come into his presence. But instead, Jacob is coming in and he is blessing Pharaoh. And I think this is pointing us to the fact that through Joseph, the nations are now being blessed by Jacob. This promise that God has given, that it's going to be through you that the nations of the world are blessed. And now it's because of Joseph that Jacob is coming in and he is blessing the king of these nations. And that word blessed comes up repeatedly there. That is not something you would expect, that Jacob is blessing Pharaoh, but that is what God has promised this whole time, is that he is going to be a blessing. Verse 12 there, it says, if I can find it. Yep. And Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all the father's household with food according to their number of dependents. So again, he's providing for them. That brings back chapter 45, verse 7. God sent me before you to preserve a remnant. This is God providing for his people through this royal seed of Joseph. Now, what happens next through the rest of chapter 47 is Joseph really dealing very shrewdly in the midst of this famine. This is Joseph doing some things that in our American sensibilities don't seem super ethical. So what happens in verse 13, it says, there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished by reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. When the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone. And Joseph answered, give us your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock if your money is gone. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for their horses, flocks, herds, and donkeys. And what happens next is they run out of food again. And they say, well, we can bring you our lives and our land, and we'll give you everything. And Joseph just keeps on taking from them to provide them with food until Pharaoh owns all the land in Egypt, and all the people of Egypt are his servants. He's brought it all the way to this point that they have literally nothing left, and he's requiring that from them to give them the food that they need to survive. So it says, verse 20, Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for all the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe on them, and the land became Pharaoh's. And as for the people, he made servants of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests did he not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on that allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, he did not sell their land. So people look at this in a lot of different ways. Some people have read this and been like, come on, Joseph, that's not really very godly of you to just take and take and take and take. I don't think that's what the narrator is wanting to give us in this. Clearly, the famine is to the point where people are going to die without Joseph's help. Some people would say that he needs to not pay them he's price gouging. From a New Testament perspective, if I'm in Joseph's position, I probably don't do this. From a New Testament perspective, knowing what we know, I probably am a little more generous and am not trying to price gouge. If you tried to do this in America today, you would probably get in a lot of trouble, and people would not be real happy that you are trying to monopolize and take everyone's stuff. Acts chapter 2, you see in the New Testament church that people are selling their own possessions to provide for those who are in need. That's a little bit different kind of way of thinking of this. If you look at the heart of Jesus in Philippians 2, Jesus emptied himself and took on the form of a servant for the sake of us. So instead of taking all the opportunities to make a profit to provide for people's needs, instead he emptied himself to provide for people's needs. But that being said, when you read this text, look, this is coming out of Pharaoh saying, is there anyone as wise as Joseph? And I think this text is emphasizing the wisdom of Joseph working for his master Pharaoh here in this story. Joseph is certainly benefiting Pharaoh in this, and Pharaoh is the one that Jacob is blessing. And so I think the emphasis of the text here is this is how Joseph is blessing the nations, not how Joseph is taking away from the nations. I think verses 23 to 26 help with this as well. Joseph said to the people, behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And at the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves and your household, and as food for your little ones. So he's basically instituting a tax on them and saying you just have to give a portion to Pharaoh. And then verse 25, they said, "You have saved our lives. May it please my Lord, we will be servants to Pharaoh." So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day that Pharaoh should have the fifth, and the land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's. So the response of the people of Egypt is not, "Why are you doing this? Why aren't you just helping us?" The response of them is like, "Yeah, absolutely. We'll be your servants. We'll do anything. You saved our lives. We would all be dead if it wasn't for you." So their response is not like he is wronging us in some way. Their response is, "We will gladly serve you because of the grace that you have shown us." And I think this actually points us, this isn't casting Joseph in a negative light. This actually is kind of putting Joseph in a similar position as Jesus. In the Bible, you see the people of Israel or the people of Egypt are desperately in need and they have no chance of survival. Jesus comes to people like us who are desperately in need with no chance of salvation. And Joseph comes in and he saves those people who are desperately in need. Jesus comes in, saves those people who are desperately in need. And then those who are saved gladly submit themselves to Joseph and to Pharaoh. And in the same way, when Jesus comes and saves us and we are desperately in need, our response is glad submission, that I will be your servant because I had nothing. I was totally helpless and would have been dead without you. I'm going to gladly submit myself as a servant. I think that teaches us a little bit about like our relationship with God, and that how our desperation and his salvation moves us to live in obedience to God. So I don't think this story points us to say Joseph's a jerk who's just like, say, I wouldn't look at this story as this is a guide to Christian economics and how we should develop social policies. I don't think that's what we see here, but I do think it points us to something about our relationship to God and how we ought to be gladly submitting ourselves to servants. In verse 27, they settle in the land, and notice what it says about Israel. It says they settle in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it, and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. We've heard those words before, right? He tells Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply. He even tells that to Noah after the flood, be fruitful and multiply. What happens in both of those cases? I mean, they're fruitful and they multiply, but they mess everything up, right? Everything just goes, and it's terrible. It's a disaster after that. And here you have, through Joseph, kind of a renewing of this. And they are fruitful and they multiply, and they are God's people becoming a great nation in Egypt, just like God promised. So again, all these narratives that are running through all of the book of Genesis, they're tying them up, and they're saying, like, through Joseph, these things are being brought full circle. This is a conclusion to the book of Genesis, even though we know that it's not a full conclusion because we have the rest of the Bible that's going to come. So in verse 29 to 31, it says, the time drew near that Israel must die, and he called his son Joseph and said to him, if now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. That's not weird. That was a thing then to make a promise. You would put your hand under someone's thigh. It was a way of making an oath. So that's just what they did then. Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place. He answered, I will do as you have said. And he said, swear to me. And he swore to him. And then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed. And I see Jacob's taking bones up out of Egypt as a foreshadowing of the Exodus. That just as Israel is brought up out to be taken back to the land of Canaan, God is going to bring up Israel. And even like Joseph is making this promise and swearing to Jacob, I will take your bones back to Canaan. I think God is promising to Jacob, I will bring your people back up and bring you back to Canaan. So Jacob is trusting in the promises of God here, that just as God said, he is going to take them up. We're going to see that again next week. Joseph really says the same thing. He wants them to take his bones with them whenever they leave Egypt. So again, he's trusting they're not going to be in Egypt forever. And that starts to make a connection to how Daniel is written. Remember, I've said there's this connection to Daniel, and how Daniel is seen as this Joseph figure that for those people who were in exile in the time of Daniel, they are seeing Daniel as this picture of like there's a foreshadowing of an exodus that is coming. The fact that Daniel looks just like Joseph says, just as Joseph was there before they were promised to be brought up out of Egypt, I think Daniel is there before they are being promised to be brought out of the land of exile of Babylon and Assyria and that sort of thing. So that is anticipating a return of people from that. Any questions on any of that? I'm going to jump out of Genesis for just a few minutes and just jump all over the place. Next week, we are going to finish the narrative and get all the way to chapter 50. Next week, Jacob is about to die, and he gives blessings to his sons. And so this very much makes the Joseph narrative the sons of Jacob narrative, because this is the promises that are kind of given to these tribes to say this is what's coming. So we're going to walk through some of those promises and what that actually does for the rest of the history of Israel and the descendants of Jacob. But I want to point out, wow, I completely forgot this too. There's great. Okay. Yeah, I think I said all that stuff, so it's okay. Doesn't matter. But with the little bit of spare time we have left, I want to point you guys to some other little passages that show us similar descriptions of God working sovereignly in the lives of people in a way that directs the hearts of kings and directs the dwelling places of nations, and in a way that ultimately leads to the salvation of his people. So I just want to point out a few verses and read them for you to show that what we're seeing in Joseph of God sovereignly working is not just a theme in Joseph. It's a theme of the Bible. The whole thing is telling this. So one of my favorite passages is in Acts 17. Paul is speaking to the Athenians in the Areopagus, and he describes God. He says, the God who made the world and everything in it, this is Acts 17, verse 24, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way towards him and find him. So what this says about God is he has determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. You see that in Joseph, right? God has made this sovereign plan that he is fulfilling, that there is going to be a boundary of their dwelling place in Canaan, but not yet. I'm going to determine that instead you're going to have this boundary of your dwelling place in Goshen in Egypt for this time. And you see him, all of the sovereign ways that God has to work to do those things, to determine an allotted dwelling place for mankind. How does God have to work in the hearts of national leaders to make nations put their boundaries and dwelling places in certain places? How does God have to work in the battles between armies that determine that sort of thing? This is Paul is saying that God has a strong hand in the movements of history in determining the ways that this is happening. You see similar things in the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 10, ultimately the people are brought up out of Egypt. They go into the land of Canaan, and then they're unfaithful in the land of Canaan. And what it says in Isaiah 10, verse 5, it's what happens is the people are unfaithful, and the empire of Assyria comes in, and they they take over Israel and they carry them out into exile. And what it says in Isaiah 10, verse 5, it says, "Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, the staff in their hands is my fury. Against a godless nation I send him, and against the people of my wrath I command him, to take spoil and to seize plunder and to tread them down like the mire of the streets." So what's happening here is it says God is sending the Assyrians to judge his people. God is sending these evil people who are going to do terrible things to carry the people of Israel out of Israel. And yet, you look down in verse 12, and it says, "When the Lord has finished all his work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, he will punish the speech of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria and the boastful look in his eyes." So this looks like Joseph's brothers, right? It's God sent me down into Egypt, but they definitely shouldn't have sold him into slavery in Egypt. And in the same way, God is somehow sovereignly working that he is sending the Assyrians to conquer Israel, and yet then later he's saying, I'm going to judge them for conquering Israel. So this is a difficult thing to understand about the sovereignty of God, but how we understand the sovereignty of God has to mesh with the responsibility of human beings. That God is in control and he has a plan that he is working actively for his glory, and human beings are responsible for the choices that we make in how that stuff plays out. You see it in Amos 3:6, which Dr. Betts is teaching in Amos. You should go back and watch those videos for this cycle. But it says, "Is a trumpet blown in a city and the people are not afraid? Does disaster come to a city unless the Lord has done it?" A lot of the time we say the Lord doesn't do disaster, the Lord does salvation. But that's not what the Bible says. The Lord is bringing this disaster that is done to a city. And this is the same sort of context, that the people of Israel and Judah have been unfaithful, and God is sending this judgment upon them. So that the Lord is doing that. If you look in Luke chapter 22, verse 22, it says, "The Son of Man goes as it has been determined, but woe to that man by whom he is betrayed." What Jesus is saying is, I am going to go and be crucified by lawless men because that's how it's been determined. That's the plan of God. That's the way that God from the beginning of time has planned to save his people. But woe to the man who betrays me into their hands. He says it's better that Judas had never been born than the judgment that Judas is going to receive. So again, you have God is working his plan. Human beings are responsible for their actions. You see that same thing in Acts chapter 2. Peter talks about how this happened. It says, "According to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified him." It was God who planned this, but you religious leaders of Israel have crucified him. You see that all over the Bible, and I think that it is important for us to hold both things to be true, that human beings are responsible for our actions. That does not take away from the big plan and sovereign control of God over all things. And that gives us hope because of what God promises in his sovereignty to bring about in the end for his people. So if you look in Romans 8, and this might be what Dr. York preaches today. I'm not sure how far he's going today. So hopefully I don't say anything that is different from what he's about to preach in a few minutes. Sorry. But he says in, where's that verse? It's in Romans 8. Wait for it. Oh, yeah. Romans 8, verse 30. Back up to 29. He says, "Those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. Those whom he predestined, he also called. Those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified." And there's a promise here that even though that's past tense, he glorified, past tense, it's looking to the future, that he is going to glorify those that he predestined and that he called and that he justified, and that there is this promise in the future that just as certainly as he has predestined us to be saved, just that certainly he will justify us and he will glorify us and he will bring to completion his promises. Does that mean at any point in our lives that we can say, oh, well, if God predestined me, I'm good. I'm definitely going to be glorified? No. Human beings have responsibility. We have to respond in faith to Jesus. We have to live our lives in submission as willing servants to God. And yet, it is the sovereignty of God that we can trust, that those whom he predestined, he called and he justified, and he will one day also glorify. So this idea of the sovereignty of God working in the life of Joseph is practical for us, not just with how we see our lives, like we need to live faithfully from day to day, but it's practical in us understanding our salvation, that just as God was in the life of Joseph working sovereignly for the salvation of his people, God is working sovereignly in our lives for the end that he will certainly glorify those that he has called to himself. And that is something that we can put a lot of hope in.